Hi, I'm Jen Miller. I'm an international program specialist with the Combating Wildlife Trafficking branch of the International Affairs Program in U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. There was a technical glitch with the original recording, so I'm re-recording this presentation, and thank you for watching. Special thanks to Jack and Sutirtha, PhD student at University of Minnesota, for inviting me here today to share with you a bit about an interesting project we've been working on in the Fish and Wildlife Service to develop out an evidence-based catalyst fund to reduce threats of wildlife trafficking. I'm expecting this talk may differ a little bit in terms of its perspective on conservation from a traditional science approach. And I plan to get into a number of different themes today. First, I'm going to tell you a little bit about a behind the scenes of financial assistance, or how donors design programs to support science and conservation on the ground. And so pull back the curtain of what that looks like from the donor's perspective. Through doing that, I plan to tell you about the role of funding and how it is quite a significant step in the conservation process itself. I'll be sharing with you opportunities and sideboards of doing conservation in the US government to show you what it's like to be a scientist working within the government. We'll be doing all of this through the lens of wildlife trafficking, specifically talking about the trade of songbirds for singing competitions. And I'll be sharing with you our approach for holistically tackling this complex socio-ecological system. So let's get started. In 2019, my team in the Combating Wildlife Trafficking branch faced this real-life scenario. We have a financial assistance program, and we had an opportunity to invest about $1.5 million annually into a new design of a program. We had a number of different sideboards like internal alignment, how do we maintain external accountability, and how do we determine our impact? But our big question top of mind was, what should we save and how through this financial assistance program? So this is what we're going to dive into today. First off, I want to acknowledge our incredible interdisciplinary team. The folks shown here are the Combating Wildlife Trafficking branch, my colleagues there. We've also been supported immensely by Foundations of Success through a contract to our branch to help facilitate some of this process. And we've been supported by a number of different leaders, staff, fellows, and contractors in the Fish and Wildlife Service and other agencies. And special thanks to American taxpayers and to Congress for funding this program that we'll talk about today. So let me start by zooming back and sharing with you about wildlife trafficking in general. When we say wildlife trafficking, we're talking about wild plants and animals that are being removed from the wild and sold as a commodity. We're talking about the illegal aspect of this when people break local, national, or international laws to sell these products or individual animals. This is an unregulated trade because it's illicit, and so it can lead to species declines by harvesting species at unsustainable rates. And trade can be domestic, meaning within a country, or it can be transnational across country boundaries. Now, the scale of wildlife trafficking is quite large. It's the third largest illegal trade behind counterfeiting and drugs, and it's a multi-billion-dollar industry worth between $72 and $216 billion each year. That includes US domestic species and illegal fish and logging. The US is among the largest documenting markets in the world for illegal wildlife trafficking, with rough estimates of around $2 billion per year. Now, I want to call out and note that there is a data bias towards the US and other countries that do provide data. But we do know that the US is quite a large consumer and creates demand for illegal products. In the US, we tend to see a high demand for products like crocodilian and ostrich leathers, for corals, for live reptiles like the horned lizards, or star tortoises, and for live birds like the songbirds shown here in a hair curler. There are a number of different types of wildlife products in demand, everything from skins used for decoration and fashion to shells used for jewelry or carving or bone for traditional medicine. Meat is obviously consumed. Live animals come in to be kept in private collections or as pets or in the zoo. And we see a lot of timber being used for carving or construction or medicine. Now, as I'm talking, let's consider how the way that an issue is framed affects how you envision the cause of the problem. So we've been talking about seizures, like I showed that data on the previous page. And this is a common type of data for trafficking because it's when we actually catch the illicit action in process. And this kind of paints a picture that wildlife trafficking may be done only by criminals at a very large and serious scale. But in reality, we all use wildlife products. So I'd like you to think about how many of you have ever brought wildlife products into another country without declaring them. And why was that? Were you short on time, short on money? Maybe you didn't understand the rules, or maybe your friends that you were with told you not to. Maybe it's a norm not to declare. So many of us have probably done this. I myself have taken jewelry in the form of shells and sculptures in the form of wood. And I don't actually know if they were harvested illegally or not, or sustainably or not, because I didn't ask when I purchased them. I didn't even think to ask. And so I have 2 points here. The first is that wildlife trafficking happens all the time. And the priority focus and the priority is that we consider in Fish and Wildlife is to focus on situations where species or communities are being hurt. And the second is that although some people, like crime syndicates, do traffic knowingly and break the law on purpose for major gains, many of the people who traffic are just kind of average people who are doing so for recreational purposes, or they don't realize that they're breaking the law, or they might feel like they have good reasons to do so from their culture or society. Wildlife trafficking trade chains are really complex, in part because of what we were just talking about, but also because there are so many steps in a trade chain. So check out this trade chain. They typically start on the left with a supplier or taking the form of a harvester or a farmer. The product is then processed in some way. Could be training of a live animal, could be killing and then processing further to create a product. There are a number of different intermediaries. There are exporters, importers, consolidators, fixers, transporters, who then move that product to a wholesaler or a retailer, and finally to the consumer. Now, through all of these stages, a product can cross multiple physical localities, different boundaries, or continents. It can involve a lot of different individuals and communities who sit within different systems of governments, including governments that have sets of laws that are customary, not written down. And there are many different types of transportation that these products are being carried through. And so all of this in combination, you can see, means that products are moving through multiple systems of rules, beliefs, attitudes, and motivations. Wildlife trafficking is intrinsically a human behavior problem, and it happens within complex socio-ecological systems. So what we end up with are these wicked, complex systems that really need an interdisciplinary approach and systems thinking to holistically address. And so the US government has attempted to do this in a number of ways. I want to give you some background on wildlife trafficking in the US government to set this up. So in 2013, President Obama issued the very first executive order on wildlife trafficking. That prompted the creation of a US national strategy in 2014 and the creation of the Eliminate, Neutralize, and Disrupt, or END Act of 2016. This was voted in with bipartisan support because wildlife trafficking has so much to do with national security that both sides of the aisle really buy into this issue. There was the creation of a presidential task force on wildlife trafficking, and this is co-chaired by the US Fish and Wildlife along with other agencies. In 2017 and 2021, we've seen that both the Trump and Biden administrations have continued this now pattern of creating executive orders that prioritize wildlife trafficking. So it truly continues to be a bipartisan issue, which is saying a lot in this political climate. In 2016, in the context of all this action around wildlife trafficking, U.S. Fish and Wildlife created the Combating Wildlife Trafficking branch in the International Affairs Program, and this is where I sit. This branch aims to provide technical and financial assistance to different partners working to combat wildlife trafficking across the world. We receive about $2 million annually in congressional appropriations, plus additional money through interagency agreements with USAID and INL that allows us to give even additional funds. And we've awarded more than $11 million through about 90 grants and cooperative agreements in the last few years for multiple approaches and species. To give you a sense of scale, these grants typically award about between $100K and up to $1 million, and the work can be done over 2 to 5 years. Now, our original program was focused on any species at a global scale. We would put out these really broad calls for grant applications to combat illegal trade of wildlife across the world. We came up with a number of different challenges. This is a very broad scope. It's global, any species, and we tended to, support really well-recognized trade issues where there's strong data for or evidence for, or at least whatever was available. We found that we were supporting well-established combating wildlife trafficking approaches, things like law enforcement, creation of laws and policy or the strengthening of them, community rangers, and new technology. And we were really struggling with, the ability to measure our impact program-wide to understand how we were moving the bar, because we tended to fund whatever proposals we received, which were not always sequential or organized around a common strategy. And so there were also these opportunities at hand to kind of counter these challenges. We found that, we knew that there were a number of lesser known trade issues that were less funded species and regions. We also had this simultaneously expansion of social science across the U.S. Fish and Wildlife. This included, we had the opportunity to strengthen our interdisciplinary approach for greater systems thinking because of additional social scientists on our team. And through their expertise, we could think about supporting cutting edge behavior change approaches, which is a social strategy for shifting human behavior. We also have within the Fish and Wildlife, and I would say across conservation generally, stronger calls for program evaluation and for evidence building to know what works in conservation in the long term. And so we had kind of this momentum around thinking about strategic programming with indicators of success, and also supporting our partners to gather evidence to determine what works in conservation. So keeping these in mind, we wanted to develop a new financial assistance program that had a really targeted, interdisciplinary, and effective approach to combating wildlife trafficking. In other words, we were thinking about, with our millions of dollars, what should we save and how should we do it? As with all new programs, there were a few sideboards we needed to keep in mind. We had logistical constraints. We had about $1.5 million annually. And these funds cancel after 2 years, which means that they need to leave Fish and Wildlife Service or the Treasury will reclaim them. And they expire after 5 years. So the programming needed to be implemented within 5 years. We were aiming for a repeatable program model so that we could design something that we could rotationally just continue to support year by year as the funding came in. And so we wouldn't have to spend a lot of time internally re-strategizing every year, which could create this kind of sporadic approach to conservation. Our mandate in the CWT branch is to combat global wildlife trafficking. And U.S. Fish and Wildlife tends to be species oriented. In fact, the authority with which we have the legal authority to give money is the U.S. Endangered Species Act, which we know uses as its unit a species, which is listed or not. We also needed to consider how to ensure internal complementarity within our program. So, for example, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife has a number of multinational conservation funds to support different species like rhinos, marine turtles, freshwater turtles. And so we wanted to avoid overlap with those species because they were already receiving millions of dollars every year. We also wanted to build on the Fish and Wildlife's expertise from our Office of Law Enforcement and to consider what other agencies were doing to invest in this issue. Agencies like Department of State, USAID, and NOAA. And so we found ourselves considering these sort of high-level opportunities, considering the sideboards at hand, and also considering this broader conservation context of literature and research that's been done about how to intelligently and smartly and strategically invest in conservation globally. I want to acknowledge that there's a rich debate on conservation investment, and it's been called out quite a lot that there are mismatches between conservation priorities and spending in terms of the location, in terms of the species. There are a lot of different prioritization templates out there, and they have these different frameworks, things like endemic bird areas or high biodiversity wilderness areas, last of the wild, and so on. Conservation-wide, there are also a lot of disparities in funding. We know that Latin America, for example, geographically, is proportionally underfunded compared to other continents, even though it has such a high biodiversity. We also know that charismatic, well-known species tend to receive funding, and that federal systems like the U.S. Fish and Wildlife tend to favor these big non-government organizations over national or local small NGOs just because they can navigate the systems. Specific for wildlife trafficking, many of these challenges still hold. So despite hundreds of millions of dollars invested annually to combat wildlife trafficking, shown by this graph, great report by the World Bank in 2016, which is currently being updated, there's actually no published prioritization frameworks, at least that I could find, our team could find, that are specific to combating wildlife trafficking and how to invest that money. And so the frameworks that exist that are all about conservation investment for certain species or for certain regions don't necessarily apply to wildlife trafficking, which is, like we talked about, these trade chains are often cross-continental, they bridge multiple communities and types of people, belief systems, and ecosystems. We do see the same disparities in funding in wildlife trafficking as we do for conservation more broadly. It's kind of just a mirror in a niche way. So Latin America, for example, we tend to see the prioritization of species like tigers and elephants, these really high-level, high-value products. They tend to also receive conservation investments to try to reduce them. And so in short, we didn't have a framework we could turn to say, how should we spend our money? And so we needed to start from scratch, or to build at least on what was already existing in the context of wildlife trafficking. So we used this program called the Open Standards for Conservation. And this is a really great product. It's a fantastic tool for conservation. And I'm often asked by conservation students, what should I spend my time on in school if I want to be a conservation practitioner? And so this is a framework. It's free. There's a lot of great open access resources online. Spend a few hours or a few days or weeks consider taking a training or just learning on your own how to use the conservation standards, because many different NGOs, government agencies, many of them use them, and it's a great tool to inform the way you do your conservation or even your research. So it could be useful for your current projects at school. The Open Standards works like this. It's basically a cycle for adaptive management that takes you from planning, implementation, analyzing, sharing, and assessing. And you can go through this cycle many times. And at the beginning, when you're planning your framework or your design, as we were, you start with a few different conceptual models. So the first is we created a situation model, which is basically a visual map of the problem. You can see on this slide how different symbols are represented, but you're basically creating like a mind map of these different issues and how they feed up into your project scope and affect your conservation target, whether it's species or it's human. You can frame it in different ways. We also create results chains, which are basically a map of the solution. And so we think about what strategies might be needed, and then logically all the different steps that would be needed, again, to affect and result in the conservation target that you're looking for. Together, we call these two things a theory of change. So here's a visual of our program level results chain. It's really complex. There's a lot going on, and so I purposefully blurred it out just to save your eyes. This work was facilitated by Foundations of Success, and so I want to shout out to them and all their immense support of our work in this space. And I want to show you, for your sake, a simplified program level results chain that we can walk through a little faster. So this is the results chain. Again, it's the solution to our challenge. And so let me walk you through from left to right about how we created our logic. So we thought that if species are prioritized, or rather if species that are at a pivotal point, meaning that they are affected by trafficking in the way that we were looking to support certain species, if they are prioritized, then we can narrow in and conduct a situation assessment to basically identify what are the priority interventions and possible partners to support. We can then issue strategic collaborative funding to support partnerships at adequate funding levels and create strategies to implement to then reduce the market for these target species. This would then allow strategies to be tested and adapted and knowledge gaps to be filled, and then partnership networks to be supported, because we believe that conservation is more effective when done in partnership with others. We can then review these pilot projects and assess what should be continued because it's working well, or maybe stopped because of challenges, or adapted as necessary. And then the most impactful projects could be scaled up. Alongside all of this, we really wanted to dig into how to ensure long-term sustainability. And so we kind of carved out these different pieces in this yellow strategy box, thinking about storytelling and capacity development for our partners who might need more professional development or internal infrastructure in their organization, thinking that all of that would result in longer term impact of our investment. And that all of this together would reduce the threat of trafficking and result in our species being improved. So I walked you through this. You can see that this is species oriented. It's including some interdisciplinary strategic thinking. We have these indicators that are measuring they're an indicator of success at various points throughout this results chain. We're focusing on partner networks and multiple funding opportunities so that we can bake in, and our partners can bake in, adaptive learning to support their work. I mentioned all the capacity building to amplify the issue and also to rally other donors to continue supporting work in this space. And so that's where we landed when we started to think about all these different sideboards and how best we could frame out our work and create a new program, a new vision for how to target wildlife trafficking. And so the vision, in essence, that we came up with at a more detailed and specific level is that we would take a species-oriented approach. Remember, Fish and Wildlife tends to be species-oriented. And this would enable us to focus in and kind of more tightly define our problem and our goals, which we could then measure. And so we envisioned that, we didn't just want to focus on one species. We wanted to be able to rotate on different species over time and make a difference to catalyze work for that species. And so when we modeled out our money and how much money we thought might make a significant difference, we figured maybe $4 to $5 million per species over about 10 years of implementation. And this would result in 2 to 3 funding opportunities, or notice of funding opportunities with that acronym. We realized that that scale is not enough to stop the trafficking or affect these really complex trade chains, but that we might be able to catalyze new work. So we would basically be giving short-term sparks of investment that would mobilize longer-term conservation. And we wanted this to be evidence-based, adaptive, and collaborative, meaning that our partners would need to demonstrate some kind of evidence to support that their work would be effective, that they would need to consider, review their work and think about the challenges that are emerging, and then pivot and evolve their project approaches. And together overall, we would try to do that as a collaborative team. And finally, we wanted to place kind of almost a disproportionate lens to enable more social science and human dimensions work. Now, when taken at a whole, we think this is really a holistic approach, because we're still supporting law enforcement, community-based conservation, some of these more traditional and well-established conservation approaches that we tend to support through to combat wildlife trafficking. But we as a team really recognize that we feel a cutting edge and a big gap to this point is supporting social science research, interventions like behavior change, and building communities of practice in this space. And so we were excited to try to lean in on this and fill out that part of the gap, which we felt was currently exists in that holistic approach. So, like I showed on that results chain, an important part of the logic to this design was to prioritize the species that we would support. Again, rotating species every few years and investing about $5 million per species. And so we came up with a prioritization process which would assess which species would meet specifically the SCCF goals that we wanted to target. So which species fall within this net that we're hoping to catch. And by species, we wanted to take a pretty loose approach to that. We mean a species or a group of species that have similar threats and interventions, so that if we invest in a certain intervention, it will benefit either one or a group of species. We've developed an initial candidate pool based on a bunch of different expertise and resources. So based on different agency expertise, based on documents from the Convention on International Trade of Fauna and Flora, it's that major international treaty on wildlife trade, major other reports like those from UNODC, scientific articles, donor information, reputable news agencies, basically any data or syntheses we can get our hands on about what species needs support now and what species is threatened from wildlife trafficking. We took that really big candidate pool and we narrowed it by scoring based on 2 different criteria categories and a total of 7 factors. So our first criteria category is conservation criteria. Now, we consider this the most objective, and so it's more heavily weighted when we calculate our final score. So each species in our candidate pool was scored to determine the level of threat. So to ensure that international trafficking, both illegal trade that is international, is a major threat, and it's causing the decline, such that if you were to solve that problem, the species would recover. We looked at funding to understand which species were really lacking funding. So are there other big donors in this space, or that a team could acquire funds to specifically focus on trade-related conservation issues. We also looked at the recovery potential. So any different biological factors, is the species actually recoverable, given its biology and its degree of decline? And each of those factors received a score of 3. Our second is implementation criteria. And this is a little bit more subjective, and so it's less heavily weighted in our score. These were factors like alignment with U.S. Fish and Wildlife and international affairs priorities. Thinking about the enabling approaches, like the political will of the current and potential future government, the social will, what is the general appetite of communities for engaging on the species? And we thought about the US government approach, wanting to take a whole of government approach, which is called out in our US National Strategy on Wildlife Trafficking. And so we thought about complementarity with other agencies. Who has done a little bit of work that really feels like it could be scaled up? And lastly, we wanted to ensure that our impact would have compounding and durable impacts, that we'd sort of have this force multiplying effect. And this could be done in a number of different ways, but we were looking for a little bit of a sweet spot that we felt like, yeah, this is the right species, because it feels like there could be other added benefits by supporting and protecting the species and the communities engaged with it through trade. So we use this prioritization framework to assess our initial pool and then narrow it down. And this is all through desk research. We then selected our top candidates, and this was followed by a multi-month, really in-depth refinement and strategy phase where we took that kind of finalist species or finalist few species and sort of tested further to see, is this truly a good fit before we finally committed. So we also developed out this species program lifecycle. I've talked about phase 1, which is prioritizing species. And that was followed by phase 2, which is about identifying the needs of a species and what kind of interventions and support would be needed to recover the species and stop trafficking. Phase 3 is to fund action. And so this phase has to do with us creating our notice of funding, and then doing the merit review panel, selecting projects, and then actually managing and implementing those projects, supporting our partners to receive the funding. And phase 4 is all about evaluating and sharing. This actually is really baked into the different phases because we're constantly learning and adapting. But that's also a final phase, is to evaluate and share, and for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife to exit each of its species at the right time. And we use the open standards for the practice of conservation again, and also baked it into our calls for funding. So we're trying to ensure that the open standards kind of permeate all levels of this work. So I'm very proud to announce the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Combating Wildlife Trafficking Program's Species Conservation Catalyst Fund, which is the name that we've given to our program. Our first few species, we have 3 that we've chosen and are starting to roll out. And they are cheetah, the trafficking of wild cubs and adults from the Horn of Africa for the pet trade in the Middle East. We also focus on saiga antelope, the trafficking of horns from Central Asia and Mongolia for use in traditional medicine across Asia. And those cheetah and saiga were launched last year in FY22. And this year, in fiscal year 24, we're launching songbirds, which looks at the trafficking of passerelle species from the Caribbean and Guyana Shield for singing competitions in North America and Europe. And so here's our website. You can check it out. We provide a broader description of the Species Conservation Catalyst Fund as well as these species. And you can see the calls for funding for all of them. But basically, like I said, we decided that a new species will be launched every 3 to 5 years based on the funding cycle and our staff capacity. And so these are our very first 3 species, which we intend to add to over time. So in this presentation, I'm going to share more about the songbird priority species or cluster of species, which is the program for which I'm the program officer on. And we selected songbirds first by, I talked about that really big pool, which we then narrowed to a smaller pool and applied the conservation or the prioritization tool on. And from 26 candidates, which was a bit of that larger pool, we honed in on 5 finalist species and finally selected songbirds, specifically in the Guyana Shield and Caribbean. And we selected songbirds for a number of different reasons. They added taxonomic and regional diversification to our cheetah and saiga, so bringing in a bird located in South America. There's very limited awareness globally on songbird trade for singing competitions specifically. And so that was a novel perspective. This taxa is also a really high priority for U.S. Fish and Wildlife because it's the focus of the international affairs CITES policy efforts and has been for years. But it's also one of the most frequently and consistently seized live animals from our Office of Law Enforcement at the ports throughout the US, especially New York and down in Florida and Miami. And so that demands a lot of resources from Fish and Wildlife to respond, to take care of these live animals, and then to process cases. And so we wanted to see if we could help tackle this issue. There are some really interesting One Health and Indigenous aspects of the singing competition. I don't know if I'll be able to go into that here, but happy to answer questions later. And we felt that this scale was suitable for about a $5 million seed fund based on the geography and based on the species. So I'd like to share a little bit more about the songbird singing competition trade. And to do that, I'm going to see if I can play this video for you.
God, family, chorus. That's my life.
This sound means it's dawn in Guyana, and if it's Sunday, that means the showdown is not too far off. Bird owners gather across the country to proudly exhibit their birds and have them face off against each other in whistling competitions called Guyana's speed singing contest.
Bird for me is not just competing, it's somewhat of my therapy. I look forward to take care of this bird on a daily basis. I really do.
It's a centuries-old tradition where male finches are caged next to each other, and judges count the number of chirps they emit in the span of 5 minutes. The first to reach 50 chirps within this time span wins, or if the time expires, whichever had the most tweets.
It's more of a civilized whistle that we have. So they will take a process and learn to whistle like that. And then we bring them on the competition.
Which can be profitable. Average singers go for around $75, while those that have won several times can cost up to $10,000. Demand for these birds is so high, they're often smuggled to places like New York. But these birds are literally not just for show. They're family members who, during the week, tag along just about everywhere. Take, for instance, 18-year-old Mark Jr. He's collecting this wild grass for his bird's breakfast.
Different. Bird is being money, bird is like loving. Like if you late, bird don't whistle, we wait till you weak enough.
How sweet the sound. For Inside Edition Digital, I'm Stephanie.
So here is portrayed the singing competitions in Guyana, and they are legal in Guyana. There is an open season for catching and selling and buying, but these singing competitions can happen year-round legally in Guyana. And it's when they cross the international borders without the appropriate permits, which is rarely ever happens in terms of getting the right permits, that they become illegal. And the quotas in Guyana are also being questioned in terms of their sustainability. But you can see that these birds are really beloved parts of the family. They are all wild caught at this point, or at least predominantly wild caught. There's not an active or regulated captive breeding program at this time. So there is great concern that several of the species are going or have gone locally extinct. The great-billed seedfinch, which looks very similar to the chestnut-bellied seedfinch in this video, is thought to have gone locally extinct due to the trade in particular, and that trade shifted to the large-billed, which has now shifted to the chestnut-bellied, as the birds are harder to find in the wild. So it's all the classic indicators of, unsustainable harvest due to trade. What else do we know about the songbird singing competition trade? This is the geography with which it's occurring across. There's interestingly domestic trade within countries like Guyana or Trinidad or Suriname, and international trade following the diaspora that move to other countries like the US, Canada, and the Netherlands. So there's also, the demand is mostly from adult men who are really passionate about singing competitions as their hobby. The birds are coming from often rural areas where the habitat is still intact, and they're caught by trappers who are sometimes indigenous communities who are then selling the birds for very little because they can only sell them for quite a little amount. She mentioned, I think, $15. But then when the birds are moved to the cities and trained up, they can be sold for as much as $10,000, which is quite a significant scaling up. And so there's really indications of market exploitation of people at the lower levels of the trade chain. And like I mentioned, we're seeing a number of different species be threatened by this trade. And so when we initially evaluated this, we used a really cool songbird database, songbird trade database specifically, that's just come out. It's called the Songbirds and Trade Database, published by Monitor and some partners. And so they include a number of different species, and we've also validated this with conservation groups on the ground, and in short, identified 15 songbird species that are facing current or potential declines due to the singing competition trade specifically. On the left, that column shows the Caribbean native species. This is a trade moving between Cuba, Florida, and potentially some other Cuban countries, as well as the species that are affected by the Guyana Shield native species, Guyana Shield trade. We decided to collect, basically group all these species as our SCCF focus because we felt that the trade was very similar, even though it is geographically split between these two regions, and potentially the interventions could be very similar. There's also some overlap between the communities, like those in New York City or in Miami, the diaspora that are using these species. Some of these are CITES listed, but not very many. We have we have one, the great-billed seedfinch, which is endangered. The Cuban bullfinch is near threatened. And we also have a potential substitute species, the red siskin, which is endangered as well. The other species, interestingly, are least concerned, but that's likely because the IUCN Red List assessments do not include trade at this moment because there's not really good data about how trade is affecting their populations. And so that's something that we identify as a significant gap. And we think that some of these are affected much more than is being reflected in their Red List postings. So we set out this SCCF Songbird program goal to implement a $5 million financial assistance program that in 10 years reduces the illegal, unsustainable trade of songbirds for singing competitions from the Guyana Shield and Caribbean and catalyzes future conservation momentum. I mentioned phase 1, where we identified the species, and phase 2 was all about identifying the needs of the species. So we conducted over 30 listening sessions with different experts from the US government, NGOs, and governments abroad. We drafted out a program plan, which is an internal document, and then conducted some strategic planning where we developed out a theory of change with 10 different subject matter experts from across our programs, including Migratory Birds, Office of Law Enforcement, and International Affairs. We used that time to create those situation analyses and results chains that I mentioned, which we then validated through a scoping trip to Guyana and Trinidad to see singing competitions for ourselves, talk to partners on the ground, and better inform our strategy. Finally, we refined that theory of change based on the trip, and we wrote our Notice of Funding Opportunity, which we posted in August of 2023. Here is a really fast overview of our songbird situation model. Again, this is the problem. I'm going to kind of work us backwards this time. So we know that wild songbirds and the international illegal and unsustainable trade of these birds was our target. Again, this is the problem. And it's being caused by illegal and unsustainable trade in songbirds. There are a number of different drivers of songbird trafficking, which can include drivers to the supply of songbirds in source countries themselves, as well as drivers of demand for songbirds in demand countries. There's insufficient laws and regulations, and insufficient law enforcement and prioritization and limitations of songbird repatriation. So those that are seized are not being able to contribute to the wild anymore, be released. That's actually where the One Health issues come into play. All of this was shaped by a lack of data and conservation awareness about the species. And so this is the problem that faces us, of course, with many more details, which I don't have time to go into. We then took a step back, and based on these problems, we identified 4 different strategies or solutions, which had to do with songbirds keepers in demand countries, conservation in source countries and around the habitats, thinking about laws, policies, and protections, how to strengthen those, as well as how to build capacity in law enforcement. And so I want to show you just one example. We'll take the example of songbird keepers in demand countries. And so again, on the right, we have wild songbirds. We're focusing on our solution now, and we want to see a reduced take of wild songbirds. And so we start by thinking about how, if factors that are influencing people's behaviors are understood, then solutions can be co-developed with relevant parties. And we're talking about parties who are, engaged in the trade themselves. Then we would be able to, form, design and implement these effective projects, which would be implemented by our grantees. And that could help change the behavior of songbird keepers so that keepers have a more strengthened sense of stewardship. They're motivated to build capacity. They have increased capacity themselves and increased awareness about the illegal and unsustainable trade. And they become empowered advocates of songbird conservation and adopt management practices themselves. They also keep sustainably sourced birds so as not to further declines in the wild. And in short, the imports of songbirds become legal, biologically sustainable, traceable, and disease-free. And that reduces the take of wild songbirds. So we developed out these results chains, and then these became the basis to inform our notice of funding opportunity, which has a number of different desired outcomes, which we ask our grantees to use as they form their projects. So this takes us into phase 3, funding action. And so in August, I mentioned, we posted our first notice of funding opportunity, which closed in December, and awards will be issued this year in fiscal year 24. And so we basically have about $3 million at this time. We plan to issue between 7 and 10 awards, and that'll be awards, again, with that average of 100K to up to $1 million per award. Don't worry about the math here, that's complicated, but there are different ways of allocating funding. And we're doing this through grants and cooperative agreements. Our NOFO had 2 different objectives. The first was to support projects that would address the trade themselves, on the ground work. And the second was we're looking for a coordinating organization which could help us bring together, ensure communication, coordination, and potentially even collaboration between these different projects. So our notice of funding was posted for 4 months. We then, in the early months of this year, conducted a merit review panel with experts on this topic to finalize, make recommendations for which applications should be turned into awards. I'm currently working on that, taking their recommendations and finalizing awards. So if you catch me in a few months, I can share with you which projects have been funded, but I am very excited that we have really strong applications and we plan to support some really robust work on this topic. This is just the first of potentially 1 or 2 more funding opportunities, so definitely follow along. Finally, I want to share about our phase 4, which is all about evaluation and sharing. And I mentioned that this is baked into our process because we believe in adaptive management. And so annually, we carry out what's called a pause and reflect session for our SCCF at the program level, which means how we're running this whole program, and also at the species level. And that happens maybe not annually, but on a timeline that feels meaningful for the partners to evaluate at the species level, how is this program being implemented? We reflect on what worked, what didn't, any potential improvements we can do. We also think about these indicators, which I'm so sad I didn't have time to get into in detail, but We measure the progress on our indicators and look for any red flags that might indicate either the program needs to be tweaked a little bit or, some other adaptive approach needs to be taken. And then we identify next steps and tasks and deadlines, of course, and here's some just images from our Miro boards during that process. We do feel like the pause and reflect sessions are really pivotal, and so we encourage our partners to do them for their own projects, just taking time to reflect on, like, is this working, is it not? Something midway so that you don't regret, when you're at the end and you realize there were opportunities for improvement. Definitely a great element of this work. And just as I'm winding up here, I wanted to share the benefits of integrating a social science perspective, which we've seen, just to help, drive home this message that a holistic approach really is important, especially by incorporating more social science into our biological approach. So 2 examples of how we've seen this have a tangible outcome. And the first is that our notice of funding opportunity included a more holistic approach and stronger social safeguards in particular. For example, in our desired outcome 1.1, we built in sustainable community livelihoods and demand and behavior change, specifically as desired outcomes, really encouraging our partners to think about these approaches in their work. We also encouraged the co-design of these projects with people involved in the trade from the beginning. So they're not just receiving the outputs of these projects, but they're part of the project from the very beginning to ensure buy-in, but also integrate their great ideas for how to, create shifts within their own communities. We also require our proposals to meet ethical standards for human research and to uphold Indigenous rights, all very important things. And so you can see that you can see some of these things if you look to our NOFO, which is on our website. We also feel that we took a more culturally sensitive and inclusive approach. So a pretty pivotal moment came when we shifted from they are doing this trade to a we language. We realized that, we needed to frame our strategic plan as if the trade communities were already our partners. And indeed, they will be, and they are becoming as we support these grants. You can see this actually in a 2023 Songbird blog article, which initially it was framed in a really law enforcement kind of they're the bad guys sort of framing. And through really critical reflection, the article completely transformed to a framing about who are the people that use these, why are they engaged on this trade, like what do they enjoy about birds, what's their perspective on it, basically writing the article as if they were our partners, because they are. And so emphasizing partnerships rather than criminality and humanizing this issue, obviously very important. But really important to be intentional about how to do this. We've done a number of outreach efforts on our SCCF. Again, I encourage you to go to our website with the barcode here. There you can find more information about our species. You can find our current funding opportunities. We've done some social media, different emails, and we also are working right now on a journal publication about the design of this program. So I appreciate you allowing me to test out some of our ideas in this talk. My last slide here is to share some of our SCCF successes to date. So as of this moment, this talk, we've committed $8.2 million, and we intend to invest $15 million in Saiga, Cheetah, and Songbird through project awards. We're excited to already think about our fourth taxa, which will come out maybe in 2 to 3 years, which is focused on, we're entertaining the idea of a plant or an invertebrate or an aquatic species. We'll just have to see what comes down the pipeline, but it'll definitely be adding to our taxonomic and geographic diversity. We've received a lot of positive feedback from our partners about this approach. They've been saying, to see our heads in the same space with the SCCF is amazing. Your top outcomes are almost word for word our top outcomes, just showing alignment between the need and what we're able to offer. We're seeing significant coordination across different sectors, regions, and aspects of a trade chain. So for example, half of our applications in the Songbird NOFO were collaborations from between 2 and 6 organizations, which represent, NGOs, universities, and government agencies. We're also seeing applications that represent cross-trade chains, so including both source and destination countries, and quite a diversity of geographic range, which also represents further that trade chain. Finally, we're seeing the projects propose and then carry out work that's filling critical gaps in knowledge and data, such as for Songbirds, what was articulated at the CITES workshop in December, trying to identify what are these key gaps that we need to understand in order to holistically and globally approach this issue in a meaningful way. So with that, I'd like to thank you. Feel free to get in touch with any questions you might have. I'd be happy to email or chat with you about this really exciting endeavor. And I appreciate you for listening. Thanks again.